Welcome back to Uncommon Christianity. And today I want to speak about a subject that has affected so many sincere believers for years, decades, and that is the subject of tithing. Now, many Christians have been taught that if they do not give 10% of their income, they're robbing God. Some have even been told if they fail to tithe, that will place themselves under a curse. And others have been warned that the devourer will take away their finances. Now, instead of giving a joyful expression of love for many people, it has become a matter of fear when giving should be something that the heart, wow, I'm so glad I can give. But instead, it's pressure and guilt and religious obligation. So believers are often left with some troubling questions. Am I dishonoring God if I do not tithe? Hmm. Am I under a curse if I do not give 10%? Is 10% really the standard God has placed on every believer in Jesus Christ? And if it is, where do the apostles clearly say that? Because we need to understand and remember the apostolic fathers set down everything we believe, and this idea that we got to go looking for it and decoding it and find it and figure it out by a verse here and a verse there is incorrect. The writings of the New Testament concerning everything we believe are just clearly written. And the idea that we have to go searching for things and come up with ideas, that's how so much of the false Christian doctrine has been created. So we're going to approach this subject like this. We're not going to begin with tradition and certainly not with church systems. We must not begin with also religious institutions that need order to sustain themselves. These are all negative ways of approaching giving. We must do what we do all the time. We must look at the scripture itself and allow the Bible to tell its own story in its own order. And I'm saying in its own order because we watch the history of the scripture of how giving was. So the best way I'm going to walk through this is to answer three questions. First, what was the tithe in the Old Testament? Good question. Second question, what should not be done with those passages today? Excellent question. In other words, are they often misunderstood and misused? And the third question, what is the actual new covenant teaching on giving? Very reasonable questions. We're going to answer all three of them. Now, what do the apostles of Jesus Christ actually say to the church? Because if the apostles do not command the church to tithe, then men have no right to bind the conscience of believers where Christ and his apostles did not. So let's walk through this together. First, let's talk about what was, looking at tithing in the Old Covenant. And why this matters, because many believers today have been taught something that does not accurately reflect the biblical system. Most Christians have been told that the tithe simply means 10% of your income given to the church. But when we read the Old Testament carefully, we discover that the tithe belonged to a much larger covenant structure, and it applied specifically to the nation of Israel under the law of Moses. It actually functioned within the national system that included the temple, the priesthood, a tribe dedicated to religious service, which was the Levitical tribe, and national worship festivals, and also care for the poor, and agricultural economy tied to the land that God gave to Israel. All of that was what the tithe had to do with. So when we talk about the tithe in the scripture, we're not originally talking about the church fundraising method. It's not what it is. We were talking about a covenant structure that God set up with Israel. And before we come to Moses, people usually refer to Abraham and want to identify tithing to us. So let's look at that. They say Abraham, tithing existed before the law because Abraham tithed, and therefore we must be the eternal principle for believers. It must be because Abraham did it. Well, let's look at the passage in Genesis. In Genesis 14, it says, and he gave him tithes of all. But when we read the story carefully, several important things become very clear. First, Abraham gave a tenth just one time. And scripture does not present this as a recurring lifelong system that Abraham practiced every week or every month or even every year. The second thing to realize there is the tenth came from Abraham's spoils of war, not from his regular income or his personal possessions. In Genesis 14, it describes Abraham as defeating the kings who captured Lot and recovering the goods that they had taken. The tithe came from those recovered goods. So Abraham was not shown here as given a 10th percentage of his salary or his livestock or his business or his ordinary increase. He was giving from the spoils connected with a military victory. And the third thing is that the Bible never says that God commanded Abraham to do this. There was no divine command in the text saying, Abraham, thou shalt tithe. It was, for Abraham, a voluntary act. The fourth thing you have to see, immediately after the event, Abraham refused to enrich himself from the spoils. In Genesis 14, 22 and 23, it says this, and Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God. He is the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread, even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you say you have made me rich. That matters greatly because Abraham honored God through Melchizedek with the tenth of his spoils, and then refused to become enriched by the rest. That is not the establishment of a financial law. That's just not what it was. It was a unique moment of gratitude for Abraham, honor, and separation unto his God. There was also another historical detail worth mentioning. In the ancient world, it was not unusual for victors in battle to dedicate a portion of their spoils to a god or a priest or a ruler as an act of thanksgiving or honor after any victory. So Abraham's actions would actually be culturally recognizable in the ancient Near Eastern world. What makes the biblical event unique is not the mere act of giving a tenth after the victory, but that Abraham directed the honor towards Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God. So Abraham's act fits its historical moment. It's something historical, but it was personal. It was voluntary and connected to the victory spoils. It was not the establishment of a universal law for the church. And the New Testament never tells believers to imitate Abraham in tithing. It tells us that our connection to Abraham is through faith In Galatians 3:7, it says plainly, know you therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. So Abraham is our father in a matter of faith, not in a matter requiring 10% system. That's not what happened. Also, it's important to look at Abraham's grandson Jacob. Genesis 28 records a moment when Jacob encountered God while traveling, and he dreamed of a ladder reaching to heaven with angels ascending and descending. And when he awoke, he realized that the Lord had revealed to himself in that place. It says in Genesis 28, it says, Jacob awakened out of his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, and he said, how dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Then later, Jacob made a vow in verses 20 to 22. And he said, and Jacob vowed a vow saying, if God will be with me, and if he will keep me in this way that I go, and give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so I will come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar, it shall be God's house. And all that thou shalt give me, I shall surely give a tenth unto thee. Again, several things are important. Excuse me. This was a personal vow, not a command from God. It was conditional. Jacob said, in effect, if God is with me, if God will keep me, if God will provide for me, and if God will bring me back in peace, then I will give a tenth unto him. So Jacob's statement is not establishing of a universal financial law. It was a personal vow of a man responding to God's preserving mercy and his future provision. So when teachers today say that Jacob said the house of God, therefore you must bring 10% into the local church, they are forcing the text to say something it just does not say. Jacob was not establishing a New Testament church practice. He was making a personal vow in response to an encounter with God. So when we put Abraham and Jacob side by side, we see two voluntary, personal, pre-law events. Neither is commanded by God, neither is presenting as binding on all believers, and neither is used by the apostolic fathers to establish church giving. Not at all. Now, hundreds of years later, the tithe became part of Israel's covenant under the law of Moses. Leviticus 27 writes, and all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. Notice the wording carefully, all the tithe of the land. The tithe primarily consisted of agricultural produce, their grain, the wine, the oil, the fruit, the livestock. And that makes sense because Israel was an agricultural nation living in a land that God had given to them. So the tithe belonged to that covenant order. Now, the Levitical tithe was to support the Levites. In Numbers 18, it simply states, behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance, for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. So the Levites had no land inheritance among the tribes. Their work was tied to the tabernacle and the temple service. So the tithe, it sustained them. Then there was festival tithes. There was also the tithes connected to the worship. In Deuteronomy 14, it says, thou shalt truly tithe the increase of all thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat it before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, the place where his name is, the tithe of your corn, the tithe of your wine, of your oil, the first of your firstlings of the herds of your flocks. In this case, the people actually consumed the tithes themselves in the context of worship and rejoicing before the Lord. So not every tithe functioned in the same way. Then every third year, there was another tithe designated for the local support of the vulnerable. We find that in Deuteronomy 14. It says, and at the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and thou shalt lay it within the gates. And the Levite, because they hath not prior inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within the gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied. So that tithe system in Israel also functioned to care for widows, orphans, strangers, and the Levites. And also beyond the tithes themselves, Israel had other laws protecting the poor. In Leviticus 19, it says, and when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of your field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of the harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, thou shalt not gather every grape of your vineyard, but thou shalt leave them for the poor and for the stranger, because I am the Lord your God. So Israel's life under the law included not only tithes, but gleaning laws and other built-in provisions for the needy. And when you put all of this together, we discover something many believers never were told. Israel's giving system was not simply one neat little 10% rule. There were multiple tithes and multiple forms of covenant provision. In practice, the overall burden connected to Israel's covenant system could exceed not a simple 10% understanding in certain years. So when modern preachers reduce all of God's eternal law is 10% of your paycheck, they are not actually describing the full Old Testament system. Honestly, the tithe belonged to a larger national covenant structure. It was connected to the land, the temple, the priesthood, the national worship, and care for the poor. That is what it was. And they say it could have been as much as 20%. Now, we understand what was. And that's how it was for Israel under the Mosaic law. Now, let's look at some things that are taught to us. And one of the most common passages they used to enforce tithing upon us, upon the church, comes from Malachi. It says, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. And then you are told that if you do not give 10% of your income, you're robbing God. That's what they use. But when you read the book of Malachi carefully in its full context, something very important becomes clear. Malachi was not speaking to the New Testament church. He was speaking to the nation of Israel under the Mosaic covenant, which we just expressed pretty thoroughly. And when he said in Malachi 3:6, for I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore, you sons of Jacob are not consumed. The phrase sons of Jacob identifies the audience. God was addressing the covenant with Israel. And the real context of Malachi begins long before chapter 3. Chapters 1 and 2 show us that God is rebuking the priests and the people for corrupt worship, polluted offerings, and covenant unfaithfulness. In Malachi 1:6, he said, a son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. Then the Lord said, if I be a father, where is my honor? And if I be a master, Where is my fear, saith the Lord of hosts unto you, you priests that despise my name? And then in verse 7, he said, you offer polluted bread upon my altar. In verse 8, he said, and if you offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And you offer the lame and the sick, is it not evil? So the issue in Malachi is not God. In Malachi is not God is not trying to teach the church how to fund local congregations. The issue is that Israel's priests and people are corrupting the covenant worship God already ordained under Moses. Then in chapter 2, he continues the rebuke. He says, and now you priests, this commandment is for you. If you will not hear, and if you will not lay it to your heart to give glory unto my name, saith the Lord of hosts, I will even send a curse upon you. So by the time we reach chapter 3, God is continuing the larger covenant indictment. He is confronting a people under the law who have neglected his ordinances, corrupted his worship, and failed in covenant faithfulness. So then in Malachi 3:8, after all of that, he says, will a man rob God? And you have robbed me, but you say, wherein have we robbed you? He says, in tithes and offerings. In that context, the meaning is clear. Under the Mosaic covenant, the people were withholding what the law required for the maintenance of temple worship and Levitical support. Then Malachi 3 says this, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that you may have meat in mine house. The storehouse was not the modern church building. It referred to the store chambers connected to the temple where the agricultural tithes were stored. Then the verse itself says that there will be much meat in my house. That is food or provision in the temple system. The passage continues with agricultural language. Listen, I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in its yield, saith the Lord. The language was about the crops and the harvest and produce and land blessing. It belonged to Israel's covenant relationship with God concerning the land he had given them. And under the covenant, obedience could bring blessing in the land, but disobedience could bring hardship affecting harvest and fruitfulness. So Malachi was addressing a specific covenant people in a specific covenant system involving priests, temple, sacrifices, agricultural tithes, storehouses, and land-based blessings and judgments. And that means something very important. Malachi 3 cannot honestly be lifted out of the covenant setting and then laid directly on New Testament believers, as though Paul or Peter taught the church that if they do not give 10% of their wages, they are robbing God and inviting financial devourer. The apostles never did that. They never used Malachi 3 to command the church to tithe. They never tell believers, bring tithes into the storehouse. They never accuse the church of robbing God or failing to tithe. They never threatened Christians with financial curse if they did not give 10%. So that should not be done. It should not be an old covenant passage that is ripped from their covenant setting and then it's used to pressure us, to frighten us, and to burden our conscience under the new covenant. It's wrong. And there is another misuse that should never be done. Not just that. It should never be said that Abraham's one-time gift from the spoils he establishes a universal law to the church. We referred to that earlier. It should not be said that Jacob's conditional vow creates permanent rule for believers. And it should not be said that the house of God's language in Jacob's story means today the local church must receive a required 10% for every Christian. Those are not honest uses of those texts. So if that's what should not be, then what is? What do the apostles actually teach? I will continue in the next episode with the conclusion of this. What is the actual New Testament teaching on giving? Until next time, let Christ be seen in you, and please stay safe.